Welcome to Realist Revolution USA. This is the podcast for real patriots who care about real America. I'm Kim, one of your resident realists, and with me, as always, is your other resident realist, my co host, Macklin.
Hello, Kim. Everybody, today we are going to get real about policing in America. We have a wonderful guest with us. I'm going to introduce you to Yvonne. Yvonne is a former police officer. And welcome, Yvonne. Would you like to give us a short introduction about who you are and what experiences you're bringing to this conversation about policing?
Yeah, thanks, Mac. Thanks for Kim for having me here. Uh, as we've had a few sidebar conversations, Mac and I at different places, I was allowed to kind of give my ideas about the difference that I see between what's happening today and how I was trained, 'cause I'm old school. I was living in Springfield, Illinois, and in the 1970s, and that's where I was when I went into the police department. And it wasn't through altruism, wanting to serve my community as a police officer. I actually went into policing as someone who wanted a job that where I could be paid equally to men and get the same benefits. That was the impetus for going into policing at the time. But I'd also worked in domestic violence program. I'd been on the board in the Springfield domestic violence program and with the Rape Crisis Center. So I thought that those skills could also be helpful. But it was never something that I was, aiming for doing in my life. I'm a gardener. That's all I want to do is I want to garden and teach gardening. And but it was a job that paid well. I actually worked for Southern Illinois University. I was hired by Southern Illinois University in Springfield when they had a medical school there. So we had a campus up there, and I went into policing from there to directly to the Police Training Institute, which is in Champaign-Urbana and is still there. And that's some things we can talk about is the difference between my training in the class of 79-1 and the classes in 1920 and 2025 and 2026 that are coming up because there's a big difference. Um, and and we can, if you have a question about that, I can explain the difference. But my training was 6 weeks, and now it's 16 weeks. So there's quite a difference in not only the length of time when we were basic trainees, but what it is today. Oh, also after I left SIU, there was a gap, and I went to work for a small town in West Central Illinois, and that's where I ended up. I was there for about 3.5 years. So total time is about 5.5 years of police work, two different situations. And yet I've kept up with the changes that I think we're probably going to talk about, which gets us into the militarizing of the police and the different ways that people are recruited today.
Awesome. I had a question for you, Yvonne, specifically about your academy training. What was it like to go through that as a woman when you did? Did you experience any, were there exceptions made for women at the time and any of the criteria you had to meet or perhaps extra qualifications or expectations that had to be met?
No. In my class, I think there were 32 of us in my class, and 4 of us were women. And we did the same thing. In fact, it was after the blizzard of 78. You guys weren't around then, but we went out to the night shoot with our firearm on one hand and a snow shovel in the other because first we had to find the target. Um, so no, there was no differentiation in our training. What I will say though, to point out, I think one of the things that I remember is at the end of the training, as I said, there were 4 of us female officers, and one of the one of our trainers called us in, and he'd been one of the harder ones to work with. He was very demanding, kind of overbearing sometimes, but he wanted us to know, what we were doing, and I appreciate that. But he called us in, and we thought we were all in trouble. Puts his feet up on the desk, and he says, "I just want to tell you one thing. You're never going to take any of these big guys down. Just get it out of your head. You're never going to control a situation by brute force." He says, "That's what those blankety blanks in there," pointing to the guys in the next room, "will do." He says, "What you have, though, is something they won't use, and that's this, your brains." And he spoke to us for quite a few minutes about how we have a different approach to things back then. And one of the things we had to use was, of course, to diffuse a situation was to think ahead. And I appreciated that. So if you're talking about and working with the guys in two different departments, there was never any personal prejudice against me. We worked well together. And I think that it's a very important part of the ethics of policing. You have to know that your partners, you can depend on them. So, they obviously depended on me. They knew they could depend on me, and that I'd be there in this situation and that I could handle it. And that's very important. I will say, though, that I had run into prejudice in other departments. In the sheriff's office in the county in which I lived um, was not fond of me. I don't know why. We never had words, but he often would make comments to his deputies and things. But again, outside of the office, they were dependable. We worked together. I think you probably heard it in the military too. These people become your backup. You have to be able to depend on them. And if you're in a situation, a department where you can't depend on them, that's life and death. And that's, again, some of the things that we see on the street, unfortunately. I've mentioned this to people before. As I've watched policing change over the decades, one of the things that's come up is not just the militarization, but the influx of people coming out of the military into policing. Now,
Mhm.
for police departments, there's a gain there. They feel like these people have been trained, which they have, but they've also come out of a mentality that is everyone's out there as the enemy and you could get killed. If they've been in a war zone, I feel that they need to be, thoroughly vetted for PTSD. If they've come out of an active war zone, I don't see that they have a purpose in domestic policing and peacekeeping. That's my personal opinion. I haven't found enough research on that to make, to verify that statement, but I've always felt that. Um, Racism is one of the things that got us into Afghanistan. You probably remember everybody was a raghead, and put somebody in one or two tours in Afghanistan or Iraq, and then you bring them back here and you put them on the streets, and it's the old, if you got a hammer, everything's a nail. How do you separate that racism that maybe saved your life in a certain situation that has no I don't feel it's valid on the streets of our cities and towns. But it saves money. Small towns, if they hire veterans, they're thinking they're saving money because they're quote unquote previously trained. But I think we brought another set of problems with that. And that's a digression from your question, Kim. But um, that's just something that's very important to me. And I did not personally feel any prejudice. In fact, I was very well respected by my fellow officers, and I'm very pleased with the people that I worked with, especially my chief of police in the small town where I worked. He was a great resource and really upheld everything that I did. So I think I was fortunate. It was a great experience for me.
I do, of course, want to get back to a lot of what you just touched on, especially now that we are deploying National Guards into cities to do policing, essentially, which are jobs they haven't necessarily been trained for. But I want to get back to the conversation about using your head as a woman versus using your brawn. And you found that to be empowering at the time. I'm curious if would it be fair to say that formally your training was the same, but uh, the unwritten rule was that the female officers are expected to de-escalate, whereas the male officers are expected to meet force with force. Is that a fair summary?
No, what he was pointing out is
Okay.
that we had an ability that could kick in before that our male officers might not stop long enough to think things through because they'd see their opponent or
Uh-huh.
their, uh, suspect as manageable physically. Whereas when we go into a situation, a bar brawl or, a big guy who's drunk and doesn't wanna get out of the car and blah, 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 we had to think a few steps ahead. And he wanted us to remember that will save us, that will keep us that's a form of protection, not a weakness. Because a guy, just because he's bigger
Mm.
than the other guy, that doesn't mean he's really gonna take him down, and in the meantime, somebody's gonna get hurt, and, but no, it certainly wasn't a put down, it was to remind us that we have that skill and we can use it.
Thanks for clarifying that. I understand.
I think that's something that obviously I don't have police training, but as a female, I think that's something that a lot of women can relate to in everyday life because we have these situations where, especially in the world now, women think about these things all the time, safety, and, you have to go out into the world with your head on a swivel, regardless of where you are or what the situation may be. And I don't know that men think that way.
No, they don't have to, and getting
Exactly.
to the situation that we have today, one of the things that I've noticed, sadly, is that, and I don't want to put this in the feminine versus masculine thinking, but women come into the military, into policing a lot of times, and rather than using some of their extra senses, let's say, they become hyper masculinized. I've seen it in situations where women are part of a group of police officers and where they might initially have said, "Whoa, we don't have to do this. We don't have to pile on." The instinct is to be just as um, forceful as the other male officers, and I think it's just indicative of our movement towards more force, and again, it's part of the militarization, all of this equipment, I mean, you've seen it in social media and in the news, um, of feeling empowered by all of that. I personally look at a lot of the people that have come into, say, ICE or into corrections, and I believe that, and into the military in the last maybe couple of decades, oftentimes these are people, and I use myself as an example. I said at the beginning, I got into it because I wanted a job where they had to pay me equal pay, right? And I wanted to have equal benefits. And I hadn't completed my college education at the time, so I thought I could take classes. In our class structure that we have today, there are fewer and fewer opportunities for just the average person, especially the lower income person, to have certain things, a good salary, a living wage, medical benefits, education. And where can you look for some of those things? Well, you can look at the military, even though our recruiting numbers are down, I know, but the military offers certain benefits, and policing offers benefits. And we're also seeing with ICE, I mean, the money that people are making going into ICE is ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's
The
yeah,
signing
it's
bonuses alone are more than most people's annual salaries.
absolutely when
There's a
so
reason for that.
Mhm.
yeah, there's a reason for that. And so I don't want to denigrate anyone who's looking into policing or into the military. I'm not saying that they're all thinking about it this way, but certainly we can see in the class structure of this country, they see it as an opportunity. Okay. Are they
Yeah.
qualified necessarily? And is what I see in ICE is a lot of people who feel disempowered in their lives in other ways, and they have been given exorbitant power in this country right now, and with no checks and balances on that. And so I think there's a combination of elements now that people, um, when people feel disempowered and then they're given a little power, it's kind of an aphrodisiac. And then when you're not
Intoxicating.
then there's yeah, it's, very good, it's intoxicating. Then when like ice, when you're giving, with impunity, powers that, go beyond, I mean, are unregulated, basically. They're like vigilantes. Yeah.
And then that
It's
racism
frightening.
comes into play that you spoke about earlier.
Absolutely. Oh, yeah, and then if they already are full of their racism when they come and they're let loose on the streets. So, we have yeah, that's, of course, a problem we can talk about for hours, but just I think it's a combination of the declining middle class, the usurping of, the safety nets that we used to have, and then this mentality that if you are racist and you are into this situation with this administration where actually being racist is acceptable and you're giving
Mhm.
this badge and this position of power, your word is well taken, Kim. It's an intoxication. It's an addiction. It becomes an addiction. So um how we stop it, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer right now. I'm working on it.
All right. Well, well, then you're no use to us if you don't have the answer to that question. No, but I was going to ask you about. You mentioned the militarization of police. That's something that I have noticed just anecdotally in my life. The cop cars in my town, they drive by and their windows and windshields are so heavily tinted, I can't even see who's driving the car. It doesn't necessarily look like a tank, but there's something very unfriendly about that to me. And I wonder if from in your opinion, there seems to be a rise in police brutality, but maybe it's just a rise in the preponderance of cameras catching it all. Is there a rise in police brutality, do you think? And is it related to the militarization of police and their equipment?
It's a it's a circle. Um, as we You can go back to the '60s and, protests in the '60s. You can go back to the race riots in Watts. I mean, and you can see that there's 2 parallels here. There is the militarization of the policing and the racism in America. They run on 2 parallel lines in, strongly, neighborhoods with a strong pattern of people of color living there. They're more likely to see a lot of police cars. Why is that? Ask yourself.
Mhm.
Okay. Are there more crimes in the area? Probably not. So, as as we've had laws and we've had budgets passed that have given the police departments more and more money. I mean, billions of money. We're looking at billions of money they've been given to purchase military equipment. You can thank Joe Biden for supporting some of that back in the '80s, which was in the '90s, which was, oh, we've got all this stuff left over from Iraq. Excuse me, in Afghanistan, what are we gonna do with it? We'll just give it to the military because, we've gotta be able to suppress some of these big riots that are gonna happen. There was always the that was always the forward thinking, is we have to be prepared. And so when you're giving people certain tools, and train them to be prepared. I mean, there's classes that are going on to teach them how to use peppers. There's a special class at PTI on pepper spray and tasing. Why?
Sure.
I never used that. I didn't have that. We didn't even have that back in the '70s and '80s, to use
And
on
that's
on the public.
specifically something
Okay,
that's yeah, that's
so eh,
specifically something that they use in the military too. They do those
Hmm.
classes.
exactly,
Interesting.
and pepper balls and all of this stuff that we're seeing them use. Um, So when you said, Matt, that you've seen, you know, strange tank-like cars on the streets, that's intimidating. If I saw people on my
Yeah.
street like that, that's intimidating. That's frightening, and that's the intent. It's a method of control. It's intimidation. Um, and it's again a military mindset that everybody out there, all of you, are potential threats to me as a police officer, and I have to be ready. And we saw that with the peaceful protests against Palestine, the encampments. These people sitting on the ground singing. What were they doing that was so frightening to a police officer? Standing up in riot gear, masks on, clubs, everything, walkie-talkies. and they've surrounded this encampment. But it's that to me, that mentality is the big problem. And then you hand them over all of this equipment, and you train them in it like it's it's a video game. They're actually training them to how do you diffuse a situation by using certain, intimidating pieces of equipment. That's not the America that I was living in, and that wasn't the policing that I was part of in the 70s and 80s. Really was the policing has always been one thing we have to know about the history of policing, it has always been about protecting capitalism. That's it. That's the bottom line. When it started in Boston, it was to protect the merchants that had, their goods were lined up at the harbor, to go out to be, to be sold overseas. Well, you got to guard that, right? Until the dock workers put it on the ships, or when it's coming in and it's getting unloaded. So they paid people to protect it. That's followed all the way down to today. When we see
Hmm.
police out there, what are they really protecting? They're protecting buildings. They're protecting storefronts. How often do we see the police actually surrounding peaceful protesters to keep, other people from hurting them? Very rarely.
Why aren't the
But
police protecting their community from ICE, right? If ICE is invading the community and abducting people in plain clothes and masks against their will with no due process, why aren't the police intervening? That's been my biggest gripe with cops lately, is that lack of allegiance to the supposedly serve and protect.
Yeah.
you raise a good point. I think we're hearing that the chief of police in Chicago has told his guys to stand down unless they see if they actually saw a civilian shooting at an ICE officer, it's necessary for them to go protect that ICE officer. Okay, I understand that.
Yeah.
Um, but as far as assisting them, they should not be assisting them. That that's illegal. ICE. But I also have a problem with the fact that they're seeing that ICE is committing illegal acts over and over again. They're kidnapping people. They're literally absconding with
Yeah.
people's property, and they're kidnapping people and separating them from their families, and yet the police stand back as if they don't have any enforcement abilities within their jurisdiction, the city, the county, or whatever. And I'm sure, because I'm not a lawyer, there's some fine line in there that allows them to do that. But I am glad the city of Chicago's chief of police, has given the order not to assist in those arrests. That's a starting point. But I have to back that up just a minute, because there's a code, whether written or unwritten, in policing, that when other officers are at a scene and they're doing what they're supposed to do, even if it's not your jurisdiction, you often feel personally responsible for helping them because they're other cops. And I
Mhm.
think sometimes in these situations, some law enforcement officers feel that way, like, well, they're fellow officers. I either got to help them or I just got to get out of their way so they can do their job. And they're not thinking
Mhm.
constitutionally. They're not thinking illegalities. So that's how sometimes they will stand back when they should. You're right, Mac, when they should intervene. Right now, what we've done is we've complicated that situation. We've messed up those. We've got too many gray lines, I think, personally. And so cops
Mhm.
are confused about what they should do until the leadership is great. Chief of police did the right thing. He gave an order to his officers. Now they know how they're supposed to respond or not respond. We're not seeing that in other cities or in other states, and they deserve that clarification.
Do you think that speaks to just a lack of leadership ability? I know you had mentioned, there's a lot of that brotherhood feeling where you have to protect your own, which I think we all, human beings are tribal. We all feel that with other people in our lives to some extent. It's obviously something that has been brought to the forefront with policing a lot in this country in the past. definitely 5 to 10 years. Um, is that kind of just a lack of leadership getting training and just other options and things for their forces that could be helpful? Do you think that reflects back mostly on the leadership, or is there another line above the leadership, be it governors or counties that, they need to step in and provide more for police
Um,
as far as training and
yes,
stuff like that
uh,
goes?
obvious yeah, obviously, you have to look to your commanding officer for directions when there's this muddy area, this gray area. Um, but chiefs of police, sheriffs, you know, we're all human beings, and we bring our own prejudices into these situations. And if someone is not thinking only about what's constitutional and according to the U.S. Constitution, the state constitution, and they're just seeing it as, um, well, they have a right to do that. Yeah, or they have their own, like, yeah, get all these immigrants out of here. They're all illegals. If that's in the back of their mind, even if they don't say it, then they can allow these things to happen. But we live in a country that the police officers should, they take an oath. The first thing you say is, I affirm that I will uphold and defend the Constitution of the United States of America and the Constitution of the state of Illinois to the best of my ability.
Mm.
That's the first thing that comes out of your mouth when you take an oath of office. I don't care who you are, where you are, what state you're in. So that should be the deciding factor, not the fact that you hate immigrants, not the fact that you hate black people, or that, that you believe that, you know, I should be free to roam the streets. That's not it. What's the Constitution say? And if you aren't sure, you should get clarification. One of the things that's happening in the military now, and I know this is a digression, but it's symptomatic after the big group of the 800 heads of military that were called in for a photo op with our leader, the Fuhrer. Um,
Yeah.
the the JAG officers, who are the legal, they're the ones that interpret the laws for the military commanders. Okay, that's their primary job. So an order comes down, like the boats being, shot up in off of Venezuela, like they're drug cartels. They should be interpreting for the commanding officer that no, that's illegal. That's piracy. But those JAG officers are being pulled out of those offices and put into, now they want to use them in immigration, as immigration judges. Why are you doing that? Why are you pulling them away from actually interpreting these laws for these commanding officers? So the same thing is true at the state level or at the county level. You have to have someone who's helping the commanders of the, police departments, the chiefs of police and in the sheriff's office to understand their real role as it pertains to the Constitution. That's probably not happening 90% of the time. Okay, 80% of the time.
Mm.
So, Mac, that's, if I
Yeah.
don't know if that answers your question or not, but um, one of the things that's happening right now that's good from my perspective is we're seeing all of these fractures in our system. We're seeing what happens when people don't know the Constitution, when they're not following the Constitution, when they don't have legal advisors to help them interpret the Constitution and give them some good guidelines. So we're seeing all that, and hopefully at some point this will make the shift away from thinking militarily about our streets and the people who live here, but more along the lines of keeping the peace, which is what police officers should be thinking about all the time. Just keeping the peace. We don't have, like
Yeah.
when when I was one of the things we did when I was a police officer, and that it was a smaller town, but every Friday night, me and my partner, Jeff, we get out of the police car right downtown where all the kids were, and we knew they were gonna try to smoke pot or drink or whatever they were gonna do. We just walked the square and talked to them. We got to know them. "How's your dad doing? Are you gonna play in the next football game? I know you had a leg injury." I mean, those are the things that we did. We got to know them, so they weren't intimidated by us, and neither were their parents. How often does that happen when you've got a guy in a armored tank, and tinted windows and, so I think we need to
Yeah.
rethink this process a little bit.
I think I
So
see. Oh, go
go
ahead,
ahead.
Mac.
Go ahead, Kim.
Okay. I was going to say, I think it very much depends on the community you're in and also the storylines that are trying to be pushed out by the press and the media. Because I have seen a lot of stories similar to what you were just talking about, Yvonne. There's in Danbury, Connecticut, this past summer, they had a refurbished ice cream truck. They called it the Copsicle ice cream truck to go
That's
out
great.
into the community to connect with the local youth. And I just last night was watching on the news. There's a town in Alabama where I guess it's become a tradition in October that the local police station is, I believe it was against the local kids at the local school. They have like a TPing competition. Like they TP the police station and then the cops go TP the
Wow.
school or something along those lines. But so I think those things are still happening. And I think maybe we're not seeing them as much because it doesn't play into this
You're
storyline
right.
that the media wants to put out that everybody's against cops and everybody hates cops. And I think I think there's certainly, I think there will always need to be more of it because police are a part of their community and they are supposed to be the ones protecting their community. But how are you going to protect a community if you don't know the community?
Absolutely right, and you said 2 things that are very important. We're not hearing those stories. I mean, I pick up some of those stories too in social media, and it's a delight. Those people are out there. Um, the cops that are giving kids basketballs when they can't afford them, and so they can play hoops with them when they come
Yeah.
down the street. I mean, those cops are out there. They're not celebrated enough, and again, it depends on the community. But you have to be willing to if you've destroyed the trust, it takes a while to rebuild it, and in those communities like Ferguson, like, different parts of Chicago, where the police have not necessarily been very respectful of the inhabitants, takes a while to rebuild it. We can do it with like just the examples that you gave, Kim. We can do it, and it doesn't have to be big ways, but not setting a tank in front of the police station. That's not the way to do it. It's these small, like you said, these small pieces of connection with the community that's very important. Yeah, I hope we can do more of that.
How do you feel, Yvonne, when you hear about movements like defund the police or abolish the police or catchphrases like ACAB, which is ACAB, all cops are bastards? I mean, those are two very different questions, but
Yeah.
you're talking about the potential for improving policing. And I'm curious how you feel about the communities of people who feel like policing is beyond repair or beyond reform
Mhm.
and needs to be abolished and built back up again. Any thoughts?
Well, personally, I don't think the catchphrase "defund the police" was a good thing. I understand the sentiment behind it. We could have done reform the police, budget. There could have been other things. Because that just, when I heard that and this is decades after I'd served in the police department, going, we don't have enough money now to do programs. I mean, that was the
Mhm.
first thing that hit my mind. It's like, oh my God, we need more money we need another better human resources. We need somebody to do mental health checks. We know there's a lot of things you can do with more money and policing and better training to do, to create some of the advocacy programs that we so desperately need. So the visual that went through my mind wasn't necessarily positive. The money that we have put into policing again has gone into equipping them to be more lethal on the streets rather than equipping them to create programs within the departments which probably difficult now, but uh, to to talk to these talk about racism and sexism and you know LGBTQ phobias and all of those things that could have been helpful along the way. If you don't have money for those programs, how do you bring that to your officers? And so, in my mind, it's not defunding them. It's it's funding, it's funneling it into other programs that can help the officers become better and more capable on the streets. Are all cops all bad? Well, I worked with 5, 8 different people, and I would say that every one of them was an upright, decent human being that probably didn't vote the way I voted. But when it came to being on the street and taking care of people, I could depend on them to do the right thing. So, okay, are all cops bad? No. They can have bad leadership. They can come with a set of prejudices and, um, not understand how that interferes with their work. They can, there's a lot of reasons for lot of reasons for people to do bad things, but look at the general population. Okay, are there more
Yeah.
bad people in policing than there are in the general population? No, I don't believe that. I believe they're a microcosm
Mhm.
of the population, but yeah, we just need to rearrange our priorities in funding, Mac, not completely defund
Do
them.
you
It's not gonna work.
do
Mm.
you think you just touched on something I wanted to ask about. Do you think that there's anything to be said for kind of the perception that people who go into policing are people who might have, be suffering from little man syndrome or people who want to go on power trips? Is there any truth to that from your experience or from what you've seen? And is there anything that can be done about that?
Believe there of course, there's some of that. And
Sure.
it touches on what I said earlier about opportunities. What's the opportunity in a teeny tiny town in Georgia, with 450 people and they need 2 cops? God only knows what they bring into policing, okay? Not Georgia's a nice state. It's very beautiful. Um,
It's lovely.
but, um, I mean, that's something that if you were well equipped and you had the personnel to do it, you could, at the beginning, monitor that. I mean, I had to take a psych eval before I got into SIU. I had to take a physical, a psych evaluation, written tests, all this other stuff. People were asking me questions, and I'm sure they should be harsher today than they were when I had to take it. But you should be able to, vet these people better. In a small town, if there's an officer that, they only have 2 positions and somebody, retires or moves away, whoever wants the job, we gotta have another police officer, city council approves it, and they hire somebody. That's a reality of, our system. So, yes, there is some of that. I feel that that's a lot of what ICE is. I have read, I watched it, these I watched the brutality of how they act, and I think it's a lot of insecure people let loose on the streets, and maybe they have a vendetta, but they are not acting appropriately, most of them, and that tells you a lot about their age. They're supposed to be trained. I can't imagine that they've had 3 months of training to be an ICE, but that's what I've heard they're supposed to get. In small towns, in other communities, cities, I would say that the process of hiring should handle some of that, Kim, initially. It doesn't always, it can't always, but
Yeah.
it should.
Yeah.
It could.
So, speaking of ICE invading our cities, and we have National Guard, which you already touched on, Yvonne, being deployed into cities to patrol. I guess they're essentially being forced into law enforcement roles. What are some concerns? Do you have any specific concerns as someone who was trained as a police officer about people who do not have that training being forced into positions of law enforcement? What are some things they don't know or things that they've been trained differently under that would inhibit their ability to enforce laws well?
Whew. Well, one is, they first of all, the National Guard shouldn't be on our streets. I mean, we have laws against that. If there's no insurrection, there's no national emergency, there's no need for them, and the governor hasn't requested them, they shouldn't be here just because the president sends them in. I mean, that I know they're filing lawsuits about that, but We have a lawless administration. So, they're kind of laughing at that and they'll run it through the courts and continue on. And that's where I get back to their commanding officers. I'm sorry, National Guard in Texas, you should know better. You should know this is an illegal request. Has the governor of California, the governor of Illinois requested needing your assistance? No. Um, so first of all, the other thing I would say, I'm going to reflect back on what I said to Kim, which was about vetting people at the beginning. I don't know that everybody knows what the Constitution is. I think everybody that goes into the military and everybody that goes into policing, everybody that goes into the administration and wants to run for office should have to take a Constitution test, the same one they give to immigrants in order to become a
Mhm.
citizen.
Mhm.
If they can't pass that test, I'm
Seems fair.
sorry, you don't belong. You do not belong in policing. You do not belong in the military. I don't care how badly we need you. That's to me,
There are people
that's
who think that the Constitution only applies to citizens, and the Constitution specifically states that a lot of those laws apply to anyone who's currently in this country, and that's just a fundamental misunderstanding about the Constitution. But continue, Yvonne.
no, absolute. No, you brought up a great example, Mac. A- and and to round up these people who are at the immigration office doing what they're supposed to do to finish up their case, how is that even acceptable? That's where, to me, the officer in that hallway for that county or that city where that court is being held should be telling that ICE officer, I'm sorry, you're not allowed in here. This is court proceedings. This is a legal proceeding that's going on. You cannot handle this person. I don't understand why that's acceptable. And I don't have an answer for that. That's what boggles my mind every day. I'm going, just stop that. Just don't let them in. Um, yeah,
Yeah.
it's a problem that we've not educated our youth. We've not educated our police. We've not educated our military on what the Constitution really says beyond the Second Amendment. Everybody wants a gun. They all know the Second Amendment. They don't know the history of the Second Amendment, but they don't know
Yeah.
anything else beyond that. That's to me, that's actually where one of the problems begins. Is we don't understand our country. We don't know our rights, and so we can't protect other people's rights.
Yeah.
That's just
I think
my
we're
rant.
lacking, I think a lot of people from police to citizens to our Senate and our Congress are lacking spines. And that is a huge part of where we are right now. And until people discover they have spines, because they're
Mhm.
humans, um, we will be kind of stuck until that point. And hopefully that breaking point will come soon, but who knows?
We're learning in a
Yeah.
pretty painful way that our laws don't matter if people won't step up to enforce them, because
Exactly.
constantly we're saying, are they allowed to do this? And the answer is often no, but it keeps happening anyway. And so
Uh-huh.
that's where the spine comes in. It's just like, just say, if people stop carrying out these executive orders, then they won't happen. Um,
And
and our
executive orders aren't laws.
That's right.
Exactly, that's right.
Yeah, you said it very well. And Kim said it. We have to step up and, demand that these law, quote unquote, enforcement officers get a spine, you know, talk to each other, examine what's
Yeah.
happening and share what you think is wrong and how to change it. Yeah.
I feel like a lot of that too comes down to that brotherhood, or brother sisterhood of police men and women. And I think,
Siblinghood.
yes, there you go. I think that it takes, and you see this in classrooms, you see this in the streets, you see this at places of work. It takes one person to say the uncomfortable thing. But once it's said, a lot of times everybody else chimes in like, yeah, you're right. And then you have a group, and that group then needs to stand up and say this is wrong, or we shouldn't be, protecting these people. We should be protecting our communities. It needs to start with a spark. And sometimes that one person has to have the spine to do it. And if they do, then it can make a huge difference for everybody.
Yeah, we
It's
think about peer pressure as a thing that kids and teenagers have to deal with, but
Hmm.
peer pressure is a lifelong
Yep.
thing that we all have to
yes.
overcome.
One caveat to that, though, for a police officer, s people who, uh, cause trouble within the ranks or snitch or, kinda try to defy certain orders and get other people to do it when they don't want to, they know that they run a risk because if you're in a situation where
Hmm.
you need their backup and they see you as the snitch or the troublemaker, that could be life and death for you. And that's one of
Yeah.
the things that plays into when you have that group mentality that just kind of everybody goes along with it. Kim's example though could be used in, a setting where there's a conversation going on in a leadership meeting,
Yeah.
where somebody could stand up and say, "I'm confused. Can we clarify this?" kind of thing. It's not going to happen on the street. It's not gonna happen when they're an active, you know, they
In real
'cause that's
time. No.
scary. That's scary. You gotta have your backup. You can't be known as the person, the outlier. So, but are there places for this discussion to happen? Or there should be. There absolutely should be. In this day and age, they should be having, they should be having a call to for everyone to have a place at the table to ask the questions. Is it happening? I don't know, and some police departments, yes, not enough yet. They should all be asking the question, "Why is it
When you,
happening?" Back.
yeah.
Mhm.
Every one of them.
Yvonne, when you were on the force, was there any sort of scenario like that? Did you have opportunities at all to voice opinions or talk about things that happened on the job on the day to day where you wanted to discuss something and maybe you weren't clear on something? Was there any sort of forum for you to voice opinions
At SIU,
or
there were 3 of
concerns?
us on our department. I just let me explain. We had a white sergeant, Larry was our sergeant. There was me, the female, and my fellow officer was black. We were called the Mod Squad. You're too young to know the Mod Squad, but it was a television program with those characters,
Hmm.
so they called us the Mod Squad. My commanding officer was a former FBI agent who looked me in the eye the day he handed me my badge, and he says, "I really wish you weren't here, but I gotta hire you." And right there, that was, oh my god, okay. Um, in the town that I worked in, we had meetings but we were all supported. I fortunately didn't work in places where I didn't feel the support that I couldn't question. I did tell my chief of police back then when they were starting these, when they pull everybody over to the side of the road and they want to check all your
Uh-huh.
license plates, your license and everything. Sometimes even ask if they can open the trunk of your car. I refused to do that in 1970, 1983, 84. I refused to do that. I said, that's unconstitutional. That's illegal search and seizure. We have no probable cause to stop these people. I mean, maybe if you see somebody with their taillight out, yeah. I think over time they've muddied that. But I just told him, I said, I don't want a lawsuit. I don't want him coming after my home and my family someday down the road for an illegal
Yeah.
arrest. And he said, okay, I hear you. And he didn't, he didn't, I didn't have a problem. He took it I had a personal
Wow.
reason and complaint. So in those instances, I never of course, I could talk about things, but I was respected for my decision, and I appreciate that still. Um, and that's the way it should be.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah.
Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
You mentioned the Second Amendment, and I'm curious about how I don't know if every single police officer is armed, but it feels like they are, and I don't know if police officers are armed when they're handing out popsicles or when they're TPing high schools, but I feel like armed cops are the norm, and My
Mhm.
personal opinion is they don't need to be, but I'd like to ask someone who's more educated and has more experience. Do you think there's any validity to disarming more and more police officers so that communities can feel safer? To your point earlier, Yvonne, you see a big, massive car a cop car that looks like a tank and has tinted windows, and that can be intimidating. I feel like a police officer with a gun at their hip is intimidating. What's your thoughts on that?
Um, well, there's two trains of thought here. A, let's just look at the climate of this country that we live in, and I wouldn't today, if all of my parameters were met about getting the militarization of the police, getting all that equipment out was, enforced, I would still not send a police officer just out in the community without a gun. Okay, until we change a
Mhm.
lot of things in this country. We have too many we have more guns and handguns and personal guns in this country than we have people, okay? There are more
Yeah.
guns out there than we have people in this United States. That to me is ridiculous. And until that changes, until we can get laws that limit the number of guns that are out there. No, if it's just a handgun on your hip and you just look like a normal cop with your uniform. I think we can do some of the things that Kim was referring to earlier, still with a gun on our hip, because it won't be noticeable. What will be noticeable is your interaction with those people. That you're talking to these kids, you're, helping people, get in and out of a traffic stop comfortably. You're not trying to bully them. I think that's a model that we could use to start.
Mhm.
But right now, with all the handguns that are out there, I'm sorry, I feel for police officers that go into certain situations if they weren't armed. It's just that they also
Mhm.
need to do what my instructor told me years ago, use their brain first. If that little kid's running around with as we know, a plastic machine gun, you don't start firing. You tell them to put it down. What do you got? What are you playing with? So that goes into training. Again, we're talking about training and um and thinking things through. But at this point in
Yeah.
time, Mac, I don't know that we can just disarm police. I wouldn't concur with
Oh,
that.
certainly. I definitely didn't mean overnight. I think and this is not to correct anything you said, Yvonne. These are your opinions, and I thank you for sharing them and being honest. I think a lot of people misunderstand the abolition movement. Abolish the police is definitely not an overnight thing, and
Yeah.
disarming police is not an overnight thing. It's long term, and it's structural. I know a lot of times when people see my abolish the police sign, their go-to thing is, well, if someone murders your wife or your mother, then who are you going to go to? It's like, yeah, of course I want there to be systems in place to help people and to fight crime and to keep people safe. So I would call the police if that happened, because we don't have those systems in place yet. But I think long term, I would
Mhm.
like to see maybe 90% of police officers or 90% of law enforcement officers, whether they're police or not, be unarmed. I don't think we need armed people showing up to a fender bender to take a report. I don't know if we need armed people going in to deal with domestic disputes, because those can get dangerous, but social workers aren't armed and they do that all the time. So again, not to correct your answer, but just to clarify where I was coming from, I did not mean to disarm police officers today.
Well, in England, for for decades, they've not had it they don't carry
Mhm.
arms. I mean,
Yeah,
you see police in London walking around anybody, and they're not armed. Somehow they've managed to keep the
right.
peace. You're right, Mac. I mean, it's not that
Yeah.
it can't happen, but
Yeah.
we've got to tumble things back, a ways mentally in this country, I think before
Yeah.
that can happen. And one thing I do think we've got to come up with a better system for legal firearms for the public. We
Yes.
don't we don't have we don't have control over that, and we need it badly.
I wanted to ask Yvonne, obviously there needs to be, or personally. I feel there should be more emphasis on de-escalation. Macklin just briefly touched on this as well. How do you feel about, would you support the idea that's been brought up in a lot of communities of having other options for responders to things, like a domestic dispute, having people like social workers or psychologists for crisis calls to remove that potentially dangerous interaction with the police where there are guns present, um, because they are there or they aren't capable or willing to go through a de-escalation process. Do you think that there's something to be said for that kind of intervention as opposed to having police be the ones who have to go and deal with these things, these types of calls?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there are towns that have mental health resource workers that go out first in certain situations. Again, it's resources. How does that
Yeah.
community allocate their resources? Are they going to allocate it to, you know, mental health responders or domestic violence responders or, that are trained, or are they just going to, just pay police officers? And if they don't have any other options, police has got to go out. But again, it's how we allocate our funds and where we put our priority. Is it on the safety of everybody? Or is it just, paying the cop on the beat? And I think that
Yeah.
we have a lot of options for improving, for improving the response to a citizen's situation that is not an illegality, a potential illegal action, you know? So, um, yeah, we just again, to me, it comes down to funding. Where do we put our money?
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
can buy
Kim, you said it in a recent episode, Kim, that you can tell your values by where you spend your
Yep,
dollars, and
Show me where you
exactly,
put your
exactly.
money. I'll show you what's important to you.
That's
that's what it
right.
was, yeah.
Yep.
I had one of my, I still remember this conversation with one of my instructors at PTI, and he said, if you and it was about de-escalation, it was about controlling the situation. How do you handle certain situations with certain groups of people? And he says, if you've had to pull your gun to get control of the situation, it's because you lost control of the situation. So
Mm,
if you're always thinking you're going to use that gun to control a crowd or whatever, that's because you haven't figured out any other way to handle this. And
Uh,
that's when things get dangerous and scary because I don't know, if I was a person in a house and some cop came up and had his gun drawn, I'd be pretty intimidated. I think I'd wanna
Yeah.
hide
yeah.
and run, okay, even if I wasn't guilty of
Mhm.
something. Ah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Looking back on your time as a police officer, Yvonne, do you have any you mentioned one moment, one interaction where you spoke up and said, "I don't think we should, this is a legal search and seizure," and you were able to voice your dissent. Do you have any other highlights or moments of pride? Or do you have any moments of regret looking back on it now that you're older and wiser and think, "I wish I had handled that situation
N
differently?"
Not so many, that I mean, I don't think there's regrets. You can always go back and say, "You could have done something different. You could have done something better." I think I was very fortunate, and maybe I have some rosy glasses over me about how we did
Yeah.
policing back in the '70s and '80s. Maybe that's my problem, when I watch what's happening now. Um, the the only, the only regret I have is I think a couple of times we used to call it a dog pile. That's when you see, an officer comes up and he tries to control a person, and then the other I mean, we see this all the time now. And they got 3 or 4 officers on this one person down on the ground. It's called a dog pile, or I mean, that's what we used to call it. I don't know what they call it today. Because it's how dogs do, somebody's barking and then the other dog barks, um and we had a situation like that with a kid who was obviously, he was high on something, and he was so combative, he wasn't controllable by one officer, and I was there, another officer was there, the 2 male officers were on him, and they couldn't get him handcuffed, and so, I'm just piling on too, and I thought, "Well, this is really stupid if these 2 guys, these big 2 guys are screaming at me to help them put the cuffs on." what what are we doing here, you know? Fortunately, we didn't hurt the kid, but I just remember after that, kinda like, "There has to be a better way to do this, you guys. We need to talk about this in the future." But that's because we didn't I just was in a small town, we didn't have the incidents that might have warranted that. Yeah, I don't you know, I can't speak for everybody because my time in service was shorter, 5.5 years isn't that long. Um, I think that if there's there are moments of I mean, there was a lot of that, Mac. There were actually the what I called the walk around the walk of fame around the square just to talk to people. My
Yeah.
one of my fellow officers, Jeff, never forget, he taught me a lot. He was one of those people that used his brains, not his brawn, and he was a big guy if he wanted to. But, he knew everybody in town. He knew their backgrounds. He knew where they lived. He wanted to know that information. That's how you do good investigative work is, who's behind this, where they live, who they hang out with, have they done this before kind of thing. But at the same time, he also knew, we did have one incident where kids stole a bike. Family was not well off. And the other officer on duty says, well, let's go see if we can find him. Like, let's go get in the squad car and drive around like we can find him. And Jeff said, give him 30 minutes. Just give him 30 minutes. We'll pull up at his house. And by golly, he waited 30 minutes. He drove up to his dad's house. He says, this is where he's going to be. And he went in, told the dad, he says, "Is so and so here?" He says, "Yeah, he just got home on a bike." He said, "Where'd you get the bike?" And I said, "It's like, right, where'd he get the bike?" Um, he handed in the bike. It said, "Well, it was just laying there somewhere." And Jeff says, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." And his dad was terrified that he was gonna get a ticket and go to jail. And Albert says, "No." They threw it in the back of the car, drove back to where he stole it, and made him go apologize and drop the bike off. Much better than giving him a ticket, much better than arresting him for minor theft,
Yeah.
which we wouldn't have done anyway, but those are the kinds of things you can do when you know the people that you're working with,
And I
and
bet
I
he never forgot that.
no, he didn't.
Exactly.
Well, he was a little troublemaker. This kid was had notorious for being a minor troublemaker, but was he evil? No. Was he a criminal? No. I hope he didn't grow up to be one. That would have been bad that we let him go. But, just saying.
Uh,
Yes. Thank you for your service to your community, Yvonne.
yes.
Well,
Yeah, is there
yeah, thank
anything
you.
else that you would like to say that you haven't had a chance to say today? And I yeah, and I echo what Kim just said. I'm sorry to cut you off, Yvonne, but, yeah, thank you for serving your community and serving it so proudly.
Well, thank you for this conversation. This has been wonderful. Just to get some, you know, Mac and I've spit things back and forth once in a while. We've been together, but it's kind of fun to unload these thoughts someplace that might have, you know, might get other people to think about it. I guess a final remark. Our police are not the problem. We want to think of the police as the bad guy in every situation. The police are not the problem. I think it's in these times where we have so much anger pent up in all of us. We've not found a more sensitive and humanizing way to deal with our problems. And police are not, they're just as susceptible to those feelings as we are. If you feel frightened or cornered or disrespected. So if we can bring more respect to the police. I know here in Carbondale, one of the things we've done is we've had a really good relationship with the police, I think, for the most part, and they've respected us. We've not been harassed by the police. We've not been, you know, they watch us, but that's their role when they see a big group of people. I just think we need to become more respectful of each other and of the difficulties that we're all living in, regardless of the job that we have, and take more time to get to know each other. Not see a group as a class or just a profession, but those police officers are members of our community. wherever you live. They belong in your community. How can we, how can we create more community around them and with them? That's what I'd like to see, and integrate them
Bring
more
back
back
some
into the community.
humanity.
Yeah,
Mm.
yeah.
Thank you so much, Yvonne. Thanks for those final thoughts.
Well,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, fellow realists, for listening. And if you enjoyed this episode and want to check out others, you can go to our website, realistrevolutionusa.com. Check us out on YouTube, and please give us a follow on any or all of our socials. And until next episode, keep it real.